Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on this Thursday, the 2nd of February 2023. My name is Freddy Gray and I will be your host today. On the show this week, we will be asking the same question as the cover of The Spectator this week. How will the war in Ukraine end? I will be talking to Owen Matthews and Dmitri Trenin about that difficult and important question. And then we will move on to talk about reality, or should I say transsexualism and the nature of reality, with none other than the great Rod Liddle. And after that, we will talk to Douglas Murray and Heather MacDonald about police violence in America. And lastly, I'll be talking to Toby Young about his finding out, thanks to Big Brother Watch, that he's being spied on by the British government for his daring to question lockdown policy. But before we get to any of that, I must thank our brilliant sponsor, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in these challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. Next month will mark the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the front cover of this week's Spectator asks the question, how will it end? It's obviously a very difficult question to answer, but a very important one. I'm joined now by Owen Matthews, who's the Spectator's Moscow correspondent, and Dmitri Trenin, who is at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, formerly of the Carnegie Center. Owen, you say in your piece that we are not in the end game yet of the war. We are still probably in what might be called the middle game. And you conclude on a rather gloomy note. I don't want to give away the ending, but I will. That you say, tragically, there is almost no realistic outcome for this war that will not end in the Ukrainians crying betrayal. Can you explain your argument?
Yes, well, I very much hope that I'm wrong, but I fear that I'm not. The main point of the piece is actually to point out two things that I think are somewhat underappreciated, both in Kiev and among Kiev supporters in the West. And those two things are that there are parts of Ukraine as constituted after the fall of the Soviet Union, namely Crimea and the rebel republics, the self-declared rebel republics of the Donbass, which really are very strongly anti-Kiev. And any scenario, as the Ukrainians now say, is their scenario for victory that involves taking those areas, involves a different kind of war. And it's a war that will suddenly be seen by the vast majority of the locals who remain. It's important, those who remain, because those who are pro-Kiev have fled Donbass. They've been terrorized and bullied into fleeing. But the people who remain in Crimea and the Russian-occupied parts of Donbass are actually will see that as a war of conquest and aggression, not a war of liberation. And that's a really serious moral and strategic problem for the end game of the war. And the second point that I wanted to make is that actually I think it's underappreciated the extent to which unfortunately, for the Ukrainians and for the prospects for peace, Putin still has enormous, very profound reserves of military and capability. He's suddenly running out of high technology, high precision rocketry and modern tanks and so on. But Russia really hasn't really gone to anything like a fully mobilized war economy yet. And that also bodes rather badly for the spring offensive or the early spring offensive that we're all expecting Putin to mount. I think that unfortunately Putin and Russia remains much stronger than the West and certainly the Ukrainians tend to appreciate.
But you would bet that a sort of stalemate or ongoing struggle will be the dominant part of the next phase of this conflict.
Well, the problem is that I certainly don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not going to get into the business of predictions. But the problem is that any peace that involves exchanging land for ceasefire or land for peace is politically fatal for Zelensky or indeed any Ukrainian leader. We can debate whether the ethics of that, of whether Crimea and parts of the Donbass should be given away. But clearly that leaves a very major moral hazard. It rewards aggression. It leaves Putin the capacity to declare some kind of victory. I mean, a hollow victory, a Pyrrhic victory, that's certainly true. So there's a huge moral hazard there. But the problem is that if it comes to the alternative to a land for peace deal is a sort of forever war. And if a forever war is going to be fought on the money, on the resources, on the guns of the West, and there are also questions about the solidity of the Western alliance. I think there are cracks that are going to appear, and I think cracks that are going to widen, unfortunately, as the war drags on.
Dmitri, Owen in his piece suggests that Zelensky is in a more precarious position than a lot of people might think. What about Putin's position? I mean, we talk a lot in the West about unease in the Kremlin, dissatisfaction with how the war's going. Are we slightly blinkered in the way we look at how the Kremlin is thinking, what's going on with Putin?
Well, frankly, I think that's the case. At least that's how I see it. I believe that despite the initial disappointment that quite a few people experienced in the first weeks of the war or of the special military operation, the vast majority of the people have focused on supporting the operation waged by their soldiers. And Putin, as a commander-in-chief, has the ultimate responsibility, of course. And in a situation like this, pointing to the mistakes made by your commander-in-chief is essentially helping the other side, helping the enemy, helping Russia's adversaries beyond Ukraine. So Putin's popularity, if I may use the word, I think the better word to use would be support, is fairly high. It's historically very high level of support. So all those rumors about elite dissatisfaction are true, but only to a certain point. There were quite a few people who were connected with the West materially, emotionally, but mostly materially. These people understood that because of this operation, they were losing a lot of money. And they essentially wanted the war to stop as soon as possible. And they wanted to be able to rescue at least some of the money that was at risk in the West. The West was confiscating not only Russian sovereign assets or sovereign currency reserves, but also private assets of Russian citizens. But this never reached the level of the top elite, or the elite, if you like, that rules the place. It is extremely dangerous, I would say, even for those people who are somewhat dissatisfied, somewhat doubtful, to show their disloyalty. So I think the elite is very much united in their support for Putin, and the population at large sees this war increasingly not as Russia's war of aggression in a foreign country, but rather as Russia's pushback against U.S.-led efforts to use Ukraine as a staging ground for operations against Russia.
Well, I wonder about that, because clearly the war has not gone successfully for Russia so far. But would you argue then that in terms of grander global strategy, it is going according to plan because of this world majority? China, Brazil, India, other major countries are moving away from the American-led order towards a more multipolar world, and that is part of Russia's plan, that Ukraine will act as a sort of lever to shift the world in that direction?
Well, I think, frankly, it's, call it Plan B, but it was no Plan B. The original plan, as I understand it, was to help internal Ukrainian forces, some political quarters, plus a portion of the Ukrainian military to topple the Zelensky regime and take over power in Kiev. And then that would be the end of the operation. That would be no war. That would be a special operation. I think that was the way it was designed. The Russian strategy has only begun, I would say, with the failure of the initial plan, which did not survive the reality check. So now you have to strategize. Now you have a very powerful enemy. You have even more powerful backers of that enemy who sit in various Western capitals. And you have to rely on the support of essentially you only have yourself to rely upon. All the rest of the non-Western world are essentially taking a neutral position. And, some of them are more sympathetic to Russia. Others are less sympathetic. Some of them are more afraid of U.S. Secondary sanctions and pressure, and others are less afraid of that. But essentially, Russia is on its own. And I think that most Russians realize now that however this present war in Ukraine may end, the hybrid war, the broader war between Russia on the one hand and the collective West on the other hand is likely to continue for maybe a couple of decades.
You say in the piece, as I mentioned earlier, that Zelensky is in a more precarious position than many think. How precarious is his position? I mean, Putin, as you say, has room to maneuver. Are you saying that Zelensky is almost stuck now?
Well, Zelensky is tremendously popular because he's been an extremely effective war leader, unexpectedly so, and he's actually extremely impressive in person, and he enjoys enormous amounts of support, including from parts of Ukrainian society that hated his guts. His opinion poll ratings were around 30% before this war. I mean, he was really on the political skids, but he has proved and surprised everybody, including the Kremlin, by the way, who thought he was just like an actor and an idiot and a sort of puppet. He's been extraordinarily impressive as a war leader. One of the main things that he's been very impressive about is rallying that Western support that has allowed Ukraine to fight. But the reason why his position is ultimately very vulnerable is something that we touched on earlier, is that actually there is no realistic endgame that fulfills his stated definition of victory. So right at the beginning of the war, Zelensky actually broadly hinted, in fact, said that we can compromise on full NATO membership, and actually broadly hinted that the status of Crimea and Donbass was up for negotiation with plebiscites and so on the condition that Russian military returned to its pre-February 24th borders. He's now moved away to a very much more aggressive position, partly because he now thinks that he has a chance of winning the war, of actually retaking Crimea and Donbass. And I personally think that that's not only militarily extremely unlikely, but actually politically dangerous, because it involves creating a revolutionary situation in Russia, essentially. That's one reason. And secondly, it involves fighting a population that actually doesn't necessarily want to be Ukrainian. So there are two major elements of Zelensky's victory plan that are essentially unachievable. So in that sense, he's somewhat painted himself into a corner. And in practical terms, if Putin comes to the table and saying, we're willing to have a ceasefire and we're going to take X amount of Ukrainian territory. And Zelensky is obviously going to say no, and that process is going to go on for a long time. But, whichever way you cut it, I think the most likely outcome is ultimately some sort of land for peace deal, which I've already said is actually going to be totally fatal for not only Zelensky, but for any Ukrainian leader to sign.
Dmitri, do you think since the invasion, the chances of a sort of Europeanized Russia have dissipated? Russia is now effectively isolated from the West. Is there any resolution to this conflict, foreseeable or imaginable resolution to this conflict, that would involve Russia not turning its back completely on the West and the West not turning its back completely on Russia?
Well, I think the West has turned its back on Russia. Frankly, I do not see the West returning to the posture vis-a-vis Russia that it held, let's say, before the start of the Ukrainian crisis back in 2014. So I just don't think. I think that the changes in places, not to speak of Poland and the Baltic states, but the changes in places like Germany or the Czech Republic, the Scandinavian countries, including Finland, are just colossal. And things will not come back to where they stayed back in 2012, 2013. With regard to Russia, I think what this war is doing is closing books on the first post-Soviet edition of the Russian state, which tried to be integrated into the West, with the West. It wanted to be in NATO. It wanted to be closely tied to the European Union. It passed a constitution that had France and Germany for models. Its elite was very much focused on Europe and the United States. They had second homes in places like Miami, Côte d'Azur, and London, of course. But this war, and it had the elite that was, very much focused on Western pop culture, mass culture. And the youth were very much in that category too, and I think that this is over. What I think Russia is embarking upon is totally unknown. It's essentially seeking to reinvent itself as a state/civilization, self-contained, self-sustained, not Western, not Eastern, something like, the global North that sits between the West and the East and has the South in its underbelly. And it plays a role in that emerging global distribution of power that has so much more in common, or that is so much closer to the roles played by non-Western nations. And domestically, again, Russia, I think, the process already started just before in the period between 14 and 22. The process of rewriting the Russian constitution, the process of coming up with a set of values, the process of rejecting the novel values of the West in gender politics, in family relations, and all these new things that traditional Russian culture clearly rejects. And this is where Russia is moving to. Again, I don't know whether Russia has passed the point of no return, but I think that Russia is definitely walking in that direction. And the war has been the most powerful impulse that set Russia on that path.
Oh, and I wonder what you make of that. I mean, clearly Russia is still a very large and powerful country, but its economy is not tremendously developed in many ways. Its army has not shown itself very well in this latest expression of hard power. If it does want to be a civilization of the North, is it not going to struggle and perhaps become really a kind of part of an emerging Chinese empire?
Well, I think, dare I say this on the Spectator podcast, but actually it has something in common with Brexit. It's the sort of folie de grandeur. It's a sort of post-imperial country that thinks it's much more bigger and more important than it actually is. I mean, in fact, Britain, as it happens, is bigger economically and more important than Russia, in fact. Russia's economy is, depending on how you measure it, but certainly in dollar terms, it's actually around the 9th or the 10th. It's roughly the same same as Italy's or Canada's. If the dollar, if the ruble collapses, then it just sort of tumbles down to sort of Mexico, South Korea levels. So the GDP of Russia is 30 times less, not 3 times less, but 30 times less that of the collective GDP of NATO. And it's these fantasies that Russia is actually sort of a major global civilization that can stand on its own and actually detach itself from, both culturally and economically from the Western world is just, a delusion. It's a delusion born of, a long imperial history and certainly of a recent history of living memory when basically the Soviet Union was the peer of America and certainly much senior and more powerful to China. But that understanding is actually a generation or two old. It's out of date. And furthermore, the Russian economy hasn't really started to collapse because there was a huge spike in energy prices over the summer. But actually, as we've seen in October already, in December already, wholesale gas prices in Europe fell to October 2021, i.e. pre-war levels. Urals crude is trading at an enormous discount, actually around $45 to $55 a barrel, and they're selling it via sanctions busting, through India and China. But nonetheless, with a production cost of $42 to $45 a barrel, Russia actually isn't making any money off its very little money off its oil. It has no one to sell its gas to. It used to sell 180 billion cubic meters a year to Europe. That's now gone down to about 30. It's selling $12 billion a year to China because it doesn't have the pipelines to expand its capacity to China. Its position as a global energy. So not only is the sort of the basic premise of that sort of Russia standing alone as a sort of great global standalone civilization flawed, but also the practicalities of it are actually going to become more and more apparent because I suspect that there's actually going to be a very steep decline in the Russian economy. So they're actually, and then what are you down to? You are indeed, as Mr. Trenin brilliantly said. I mean, you're then down to the level of someone like countries like Turkey or Iran, which have enormous regional nuisance value. They have powerful militaries, but that's in no way comparable or appear to the countries that Putin and the Russian elite think that they are a peer to, i.e. the Americans and the Chinese. It's sadly based on a fantasy.
Owen and Dmitri, we better end it there, but thank you very much for coming on. We didn't answer the question how it will end, but that was an impossible ask, but that was a very interesting discussion. Thank you. Now, this week, Nicola Sturgeon and transsexualism have been in the news once again. Is the Scottish National Party facing up to what happens when ideology confronts reality? Rod Liddle has explored this question in his column this week, a typically brilliant column. Rod joins us now. Hello, Rod.
Good morning, mate.
Can you start with the strange allegory of Chicken Little, Renard to Chicken Little. Could you take us a little bit through the allegory for people that haven't read the column?
Yes, it's a nursery story, really, isn't it? Nursery tale. It's about a fox called Reynard who notices that a job is going vacant at a local chicken coop and changes his name to Chicken Little in order to secure this employment opportunity, and convinces the board members who interview him for the job and who consist of members of the Scottish National Party that he should have the job, largely by kind of sellotaping red plastic wattles to the bottom of his chin. When the wattles he got the wattles from a Christmas cracker. And of course, he's given the job until it is revealed that he's done this ruse before and eaten an entire coop of chickens. And so there's a certain kind of furore. And indeed, the Scottish National Party interviewers decide actually you shouldn't have this job. You must go and live amongst foxes and do your work amongst foxes. And then they extend that to all other foxes, deciding that whilst those that identify as chickens undoubtedly are chickens, for some undisclosed reason, they are not allowed to live in chicken coops or take up employment opportunities therein. And no one believes any of this. Nobody. I don't believe for a single moment that any members of the Scottish National Party, who are morons, believed that double rapist was a woman. No, I don't think anybody does. The rapist didn't believe he was a woman. His ex-wife didn't believe he was a woman. Nobody believes he's a woman. The biologists don't believe he's a woman. You know, he's not a woman. He's a he. And so this absurdity is played out to the detriment of the SNP. So we should obviously welcome this story because it has shown a woke agenda as being an insane ideology, a genuinely insane ideology, which is very, very easily revealed to be an act of lunacy.
And as you say, some sporting bodies are now confronting reality and accepting that trans women can't.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the point, Freddie, isn't it? That all the institutions which actually live in the real world have seen that this is an absurdity. So more and more sporting bodies are now deciding that what they call trans women and what the rest of us would call the men should not be taking part in competitions against women. And they do that because they realise that if that were allowed to happen, we would see an end to women's sport pretty quickly. It would all be, rather hirsute, bearded ladies in not terribly well-fitting wigs, winning cycling races and swimming races and wrestling bouts and so on. But I suspect, as I say in the piece, I suspect that still, if you asked the corporate leaders of these institutions, if that meant that they thought that someone who transitioned to being a woman was a real woman, they would say, well, yes, of course they are. They would perpetuate the same downright, easily disprovable lie. They would continue to go along with it.
Well, this brings us back to what we talked about last time we had you on, Rod, which is the trouble with truth at the moment and relativism, in that you can say one thing is true in one instance, and it can be the complete opposite can be true in a different instance. I mean, isn't the bigger problem that nobody really cares what's true?
Yeah, it's doublethink, and people are enabled to do this doublethink because they sign up to an ideology which has no rationality, which is post-rational. There is no logic to it, no rationality to it. And of course, it's made easier to do so by the fraying bonds of what we call truth, so that these days the people who subscribe to this ideology, this idiotic and demonstrably lunatic ideology, will disavow rational inquiry and empirical inquiry and insist that their truth, my truth, is the only thing that matters, thereby kind of obviating any possible rational inquiry into the idiocies that they think.
Rishi Sunak's government has picked a fight, sort of, with Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP over this, and politically it seemed like quite a sensible thing to do. Do you think that the Tory party are wise to pick these fights? Do you think they actually are willing to, deep down, and do you think they will win these fights?
They'd certainly win them, but they haven't picked anywhere near enough of them. If they picked more of these fights, and particularly on the race issues and decolonisation and all that sort of stuff, they would win them, and they would win more public support, and they would put Sir Keir Starmer in a very, very difficult position, as indeed, because Sir Keir, of course, still doesn't know what a woman is. And he's still apt to sort of bob down on one knee whenever the feeling takes him. And all these expressions of madness which come from this ideology are antithetical to the vast majority of people in the country, and the Conservatives can only gain by exploiting them. But as matched against that, you have to say that we've had a Conservative Party in power for 12 years, 13 years nearly, and it is under that party that these things have thrived. It's under that party that the Tavistock Clinic was allowed to go ahead and mutilate children. And that Stonewall was able to spew its odious propaganda into the nation's schools. And the police officers went down on one knee to the thugs from BLM, which I believe means buy larger mansions. I'm not sure. I forget what the actual phrase is. So you cannot trust the Tories to do this. You cannot trust the Tories to especially when there are prominent Conservatives who are genuinely afflicted by the same lunacy as Sir Keir Starmer, such as the odious Carolyn Noakes, for example.
Well, I was going to say that a lot of Tory MPs are very nervous on this issue, or even inclined to say the opposite of what's obviously true and real. I mean, why is it when there's obviously a good electoral incentive to do it, they can put themselves on the side of what most people think and what a lot of people are angry about, and yet within Westminster, within the SW1 bubble, there is this allergy to it?
Well, sure. I mean, the most important thing to say is that these people are hiding from the truth. And that's the first and most important thing. On the electoral side of things, we are ruled by a liberal elite, Freddie, and have been. It was the same, in a sense, with Brexit. Now, there is no good. I'm not trying to argue that Brexit is anywhere near as straightforward as the trans issue and BLM and so on. It clearly isn't. I mean, Brexit could have gone either way, and I could have voted either way. But nonetheless, if you look at the House of Commons at the time of the Brexit vote, it was something like 80% in favour of Remain. We are led by a liberal elite, and the liberal elite has values which are not remotely shared by the vast majority of people in the country. I mean, frankly, if I was Carolyn Noakes or Justine Greening or anyone of that lot, I'd join the Liberal Democrats. I'd go and join Velma from Scooby-Doo in the Liberal Democrats, because they are not conservative.
But well, some people are joining parties like the party you're a bit involved with, the SDP. Others are joining Reform because they feel that on these cultural issues that people are very concerned about, the only people willing to talk in real, commonsensical, normal truthful terms, are outside of the uniparty, for want of a better word, of Labour and Tory.
No, that's exactly right. So the SDP does indeed, have a very clear line on this. It doesn't wish for transgender people to be subjected to hostility or intolerance, but it will not go along with something which is just plainly and obviously a lie. And I believe the Reform, I haven't spoken to Richard Tice recently, but I assume Richard thinks exactly the same way. But as I say, our institutions are captured by this bubble, have been captured by this bubble. The BBC, the universities, and the quangos, the charities, they are all captured by this same absolute idiocy. And the newspapers, it is bizarre to read in a right of centre newspaper this particular rapist being referred to as she. It is just bizarre. They seem to they understand clearly that it's an absurdity that he was allowed into a women's prison, but they are incapable of addressing their own inability to understand why it's an absurdity, i.e. that he's a man. It is utterly bizarre.
Well, I suppose language is the key thing there, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
Once you attack language, you can dismantle the truth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The language is important. And the language is important. The way the newspapers present the language is crucially important. If even newspapers such as the Daily Telegraph are able to refer to men as women simply because the men wish to be women, then it is very, very difficult for the forces of rationality and empiricism and common sense to muster a proper defence. I mean, we play a part in this, and we shouldn't forget that.
Well, Rod, I wonder how Chicken Little's career is going to end up. I think maybe chairman of the BBC.
Yeah, I would have thought almost certainly. The Chicken Little. I was trying to think of names of fictional chickens. This is the problem when you come to write these pieces and you get this good idea, or you think it's a good idea, and then you're suddenly, I've sat at this desk for nearly an hour thinking, famous fucking chickens, and all I could think of was Chicken Little, and I thought, but is there a name which I could have which people would immediately think chicken?
Yeah,
and I thought Jenny. But that doesn't work. It doesn't work, does it?
I'm stuck
I mean,
too.
what would you have come up with?
I'm stuck too. I can't. I've gone completely blank.
There's loads for foxes. You could have Reynard. You could have Todd.
Yes.
Well, I say loads. There's two. But at least there's two. For chickens, what have you got? You know,
I've got nothing. I'm drawing a blank.
No. Well, that's the problem I had. You know, this goes up to 11.
It's a major literary problem. Thank you very much, Rod. Do come on again soon. Now, let's go to America, where police violence is in the news again. Last month, Tyree Nichols was in Memphis, was pulled out of a car by police, pepper sprayed and beaten so badly that he died in hospital a few days later. The police in question, all 5 police officers turned out to be black, and yet commentators are talking again about white supremacy in regards to policing in America. I'm joined now by the Spectator's Douglas Murray and Heather MacDonald, who is from a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, I should say. Douglas, you explore this in your column this week. Can you explain for viewers who might be a bit baffled as to how 5 black police officers killing a black person is white supremacy?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised if people are baffled. It is rather baffling. The family of Nichols and others had applied for police body cam footage to be released. It was released, a matter of within days of his death. And when it was released, everyone could see, of course, that the 5 arresting officers were all black. And America heaved a kind of sigh of relief, I have to say, I think, at that moment. The relief that, America is always only one bad police interaction, from riots, burnings, lootings, and much more. So the 5 officers turned out to be black. And unfortunately for America, there is this prevailing narrative that everything can be explained by white supremacy. And so when the 5 officers turned out to be black, like their victim, these same people just kept saying, well, still white supremacy. That included the CNN's Van Jones, who said just because the officers were black doesn't mean that this wasn't a racist killing. But all the way up to the president. If you look at the president, I cite this in the article, if you look at the rhetoric the President Biden used about it, he talked about how tired and exhausted he was. This is the language of the modern movement on this. How exhausted he was, and how exhausted black and brown people are in America, having to see footage of black people being killed so regularly. So basically, I'm afraid, Freddie, although this has nothing to do with white supremacy, much of America is continuing to pretend that it does, because it has no other narrative.
And as you say in your piece, that there's this strange way in which the British media, and in particular the BBC, pick up these stories as if somehow they are part of the British experience of white supremacy. Can you say a bit more about that? That's right.
I mean, the American experience is unique to America, as all countries' experience is, but in Britain we import this as well. We had guests on British television talking about the same thing, that this was white supremacy, a white supremacist killing. And it's very striking to me that this happens when there's police violence in France, as there was just again the other day when the anti-pensions protests in Paris. When the French police brutalize people, the British media doesn't run on it day after day after day. There's something very interesting about the way in which Britain is always just in the same melee as the American culture wars these days.
Heather, Douglas, I think in his column says it calls it a wish it was the civil rights era racial lens. Is there something of that going on, that there's almost a sort of nostalgia for the simplicity of the civil rights era?
Absolutely, and it's tragic really to look at our current civil rights heroes, above all George Floyd, who has monuments to him. He's got alleged civil rights laws named in his behalf. And by and large, the people that we are in recent decades, or certainly at least a decade, venerating as civil rights heroes are almost uniformly criminals, because the way you get elevated to the civil rights pantheon these days is to be abused apparently by a police officer. And the fact of the matter remains is that to do that, you really should be a criminal. If you're law-abiding, and even if an officer mistakenly tries to stop you and you comply with his orders, nothing is going to happen. Resisting arrest is the key to all of these sometimes very tragic interactions. But we have very few actual civil rights heroes today, because America, as awful as its past was, and I actually think that conservatives are sometimes at risk for whitewashing how gratuitously cruel and sadistic whites were towards blacks up until very, very recently. It is completely not the reality today. The reality is black privilege, not white privilege, however much that was reversed in the past. So I think there's definitely a nostalgia for the real moral sort of purities of the civil rights era. And I would just add, one difficulty with instances like this is another conservative safe harbor is that if there is a black officer involved in a contested use of force, conservatives will also breathe a sigh of relief in saying, well, we should put off stage now any kind of racism presupposition. Well, I would say we should also put that off when it's a white officer. To take safe harbor in the fact that it's a black officer implies that it's a legitimate inference to say there may be racism involved if it's a white cop on a black suspect. And I reject that entirely. Absent affirmative evidence of racial animus, which we almost never have now. We did not have it in the Derek Chauvin knee on the windpipe or neck or shoulders of George Floyd. We simply, at this point, should never be presuming racial animus, even when there's whites involved.
Heather, there's a huge body of data. The Washington Post has compiled a huge database on cop violence. There's been lots and lots of other studies, and you mentioned them in a brilliant piece that was published yesterday on Spectator World. I mean, the statistics on the likelihood of a policeman being killed himself, set against, say, the likelihood of an unarmed black man being killed by police, are extraordinary. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Give us some examples.
Yeah, well, this is some data crunching I did. The public is completely ignorant about police shootings, about this so-called epidemic of police bias, because the perception that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black men is an optical illusion. It has no connection to reality. It is the creation of wildly selective media coverage, looking only at black victims of police shootings and ignoring those 50% or so white victims of fatal police shootings every year. 1,000 fatal police shootings of civilians. About half of those are white, about 25% are black. Put that 250 victims of fatal police shootings in context, and virtually all of those victims are armed, violent, or resisting. In 2020, there were 10,000 blacks killed in criminal homicides. mostly overwhelmingly by other blacks. There's a population of 44 million blacks. So the 250, you could get rid of all cop shootings tomorrow, and that would be a good thing, but very unlikely given the amount of inner city violence. It would have virtually no effect on the black death by homicide rate. But the really critical number is the number of allegedly unarmed blacks who are shot by the police. And in 2022, that number was 7. Now, that's after extraordinary efforts on the part of the Washington Post to get its unarmed black number up as high as possible. Traditionally, the Post has characterized people who are grabbing an officer's gun as unarmed. Well, I can tell you, if you're an officer and somebody's trying to grab your gun, you can assume he's going to use it against you. That person should not be deemed unarmed. But if you take those 7 at face value and compare that to the numbers of police who are killed each year, and particularly by the numbers of police killed by blacks, historically, blacks have made up about 42%, black males rather, have made up about 42% of all cop killers nationwide, even though black males are 6% of the nation's population. If you do the calculation on a per capita basis, and there were about 73 police officers killed in 2021, you get the fact that a police officer is 400 times as likely to be killed by a black male as an unarmed black is to be killed by a police officer. So the risks in policing are exactly the opposite of what the progressive left tells us. And the progressive left loves to say, Radley Balko at the Washington Post always says, oh, policing is really safe, finding, like the 2 remaining non-climate changed exiled miners in the country. And maybe they have a higher chance of dying on the job than a police officer. But the left always says, well, policing is a really, really safe job. Well, if policing is safe, then being an unarmed black vis-a-vis the police is 400 times safer.
Douglas, Heather points to all those quite striking statistics that definitely jar with what we hear on most of the media. But I wonder if this is partly to do with the problem of technology and viral media and so on, in that you can throw as many statistics as you like, but that's never going to compete with the power or the emotional reaction to a viral video of a man being beaten to death.
Well, that's true. Firstly, I mean, what Heather says about the optical illusion is so true. Things like the Washington Post database that both of you have pointed to, you could argue are part of the problem. People who describe themselves as very liberal think it's over 10,000 unarmed black Americans who are killed every year by the American police. So there's, in a way, the concentration of effort and attention on this has distorted reality. And I'm afraid when it comes to the international arena, looking at the US, there are simply race hucksters around the world who want a bit of this action. I give the example in my column this week of David Lammy. He's not a minor figure. If Labour in power, he'd be foreign secretary. He's the shadow foreign secretary at the moment. What does he say after this tape is released? But, I'm exhausted by having to see yet more footage of, first of all, nobody's making you have to watch, horrible police body cam footage of deaths. You don't have to be put through it. I don't seek out body cam footage of all the black or white people who are arrested aggressively by American officers any year. But he says, I'm exhausted by it. Yet again, it just goes to remind us of, the threat to black people. He doesn't bother to tell his viewers and readers that the cops in question were black. He doesn't bother with that, but he is willing to play the race card. It's a fake academic huckster, Dr. Shoz something, who went on Sky News the other day and said to Kay Burley, this killing was because of white supremacy. I'm afraid this stuff is all picked up by British race hucksters and others around the world who simply are doing a power grab on the basis of this false narrative from America. They point to it. They try to make themselves the Martin Luther Kings or Malcolm X's of their day in the relevant countries. And I'm afraid that in the main, and this is one of the reasons it's such a relief always speaking with Heather McDonald, in the main, in Britain, America, and elsewhere, the adults have left the room.
Heather and Douglas, thank you very much indeed. Now let's talk about Big Brother, because Big Brother Watch, which is a civil liberties organisation, has published a report about government surveillance of people who were critical of the government during lockdown. One of the people they were spying on was Toby Young, who joins me here. Toby, enemy of the state that you are. How did you come across it? You've written about it this week. How did you? When did you first realise that Big Brother Watch might be right?
Well, I knew of the existence of these shadowy organisations within Whitehall departments like the Counter-Disinformation Unit in DCMS. I mean, there are about half a dozen of these units across Whitehall, and often staffed by former security personnel, and for the most part set up to deal with the threat of disinformation, originally being kind of used by agents of foreign powers like Russia and China to destabilise elections and so forth. So seemingly a legitimate reason for setting them up, but during the pandemic I was aware that there'd been a certain amount of mission creep and they were now being used to monitor supposed disinformation and misinformation being put out by British citizens about the government's pandemic response. But I didn't think they'd actually go so far as to be monitoring my activity. But I was contacted by Big Brother Watch about 6 months ago, and they said, will you submit some subject access requests to these various departments to see if you were in fact one of the people these units were monitoring? And I didn't think I would be, and I thought it was kind of pointless, but I played along, and then lo and behold, turned out I was, and I wasn't the only one. You know, Peter Hitchens, Julia Hartley-Brewer, Carl Hennigan, Tom Jefferson, I mean a number of Spectator journalists, but also some Conservative MPs like David Davis, Lord Sumption, former head of the Supreme Court. I mean, quite extraordinary how many people were caught in this surveillance net. One of the organisations involved on secondment, I think, to DCMS was the 77th Brigade, which is a brigade of the British Army, largely staffed by reservists, but which has been created to deal with these threats to, you know, our cyber security. But what's shocking about it, I think, is that people like me, people like Peter Hitchens, Julia Hartley-Brewer, Carl Hennigan, are considered, you know, enemy combatants, enemies of the state, adversaries, people that the government, you know, has persuaded these various shadowy organisations to keep an eye on. I mean, to be clear, they weren't monitoring our WhatsApp messages or our, you know, telephone conversations. It was all stuff that was in the public domain. But where it gets quite sinister, I think, is that sometimes they would flag social media posts, you know, produced by one of these adversaries, and the agencies would flag it up as being a breach of the terms of service of Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, and then they would recommend to the department in question that they flag it up, use their trusted flagger status to then alert Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to the fact that so-and-so had breached their terms of service in the hope of getting them banned. And they undoubtedly did that, and in some cases did it successfully. They didn't do it in my case. One of the things that one of my subject access requests uncovered is that they'd considered doing it in my case. I think the Counter-Disinformation Unit had flagged a fairly innocuous post on Twitter in which I pointed out that an anti-vaccine passport petition in France had 1.2 million signatures. Apparently this was misinformation, even though it was a perfectly straightforward factual account. And they said you could flag this to Twitter as a breach of their terms and conditions, but there might be free speech implications if you did, in his case. So it's saying, you know, because he's a fairly well-known journalist and set up this pro-free speech organisation, you might want to think twice about trying to get him banned by Twitter. But other people, I'm sure, weren't so lucky, weren't given a pass.
Yes, in a way that's reassuring, and it shows that they were aware that there's a free speech problem there. But at the other time, it's more sinister, isn't it? Because of course, you know, let's say you weren't the president of the Free Speech Union, they wouldn't have flagged this, and your tweet would have been wiped.
Yeah, I mean, and we know from the Twitter files that this kind of thing happened in the United States during the pandemic. People who were critical of the US government's pandemic response, like Jay Bhattacharya, professor of medicine at Stanford, were banned or shadow banned by Twitter at the request of various state agencies. So I think, this Big Brother report called the Ministry of Truth, it's really the British Twitter files. Turns out that lots of state agencies here were also using their trusted flagger status to contact big tech social media platforms and try and sort of apply pressure. Not kind of demand, not threaten them with legal repercussions if they didn't, but nonetheless apply pressure to ban people who were being critical of the government's response. I guess the government's rationale is, this was a public emergency, and what these people were tweeting could have harmed public health. And in that way, they kind of somehow managed to kind of elide the distinction between criticism of a government's policies and criticism of something which was in the interests of the state. So we weren't just enemies of the government. It would have been inappropriate, I think, to ask these agencies to monitor the social media activities of people who were merely criticising government policy on party political grounds. That would have been an inappropriate use of these supposedly politically neutral, personnel in working with these agencies. But because they managed to conflate what they were doing with the national interest, because if you criticised the government's policies, in their view, you were endangering public safety,
yes,
they therefore justified monitoring people like us, or persuaded the personnel working for these agencies to do that.
And it was broad too, so it would have been sort of whether masking is effective was one example you mentioned in your. That was seen as questioning whether masking is an effective way to stop transmission was seen as misinformation.
Yes.
Obviously, vaccines is a big topic. Lockdown policies, whether 6 people is the appropriate way of stopping the virus transmitting.
Yeah.
So they were applying it to all sorts of things about which the government didn't know the answers, so didn't have the truth, but was just branding other things as misinformation.
The government at the time tried to present these policies as completely uncontentious, scientific, evidence-based policies. And therefore anyone challenging them was a kind of science denialist who was trying to endanger the public by conjuring up all sorts of ludicrous reasons to kind of cast doubt. But actually it turns out they were pretty much making it up as they were going along. They weren't following the science. But that was the narrative at the time. And seemingly it was a narrative bought into by these various shadowy agencies, only one step removed from the security services.
And as you say in your excellent column, this time it was just about pandemic stuff, and it was a national emergency in many ways, but there could easily be a next time. And it's not like these groups in the government, the Rapid Response Unit, they're not going away. The 77th Brigade, which is part of the army, is not going to vanish anytime soon. They now see themselves as the arbiters of information and truth. It could apply to another subject quite easily.
Absolutely. Now, I spoke to someone, a source, who knows the 77th Brigade quite well. And he said, what you should be worried about is not what the 77th Brigade and these other agencies did during the pandemic, because they only really monitored stuff that was in the public domain, and the worst that they did was recommend that the government officials at these departments contact social media companies and try to get you banned. It could be much worse, he said, under a Labour government. Let's suppose Keir Starmer decides we're in the midst of a climate emergency. And anyone challenging the net zero climate emergency agenda is guilty of disseminating misinformation. He could, in those circumstances, persuade these agencies, persuade the 77th Brigade to start monitoring in a much more aggressive, intrusive way people like me. And one of the things which may have stayed the hand of people like Matt Hancock, even Michael Gove in the Cabinet Office, when these agencies flagged up that people like me and Julia Hartley-Brewer and Peter Hitchens were supposedly endangering the public by challenging mask mandates and vaccine passports. One of the things which stayed their hand might have been that they actually knew us. We go to we drink in the same pubs as them, we go to dinner parties with them, we've known them
you spread misinformation in 40 years.
But we don't have those sorts of links with the Labour Party. We're not socialists, we're broadly speaking conservative, so they might not be constrained in that way. They might think, aha, here's an opportunity to really skewer someone who's been a thorn in our side for decades. So my real concern is, given that the Rubicon has been crossed, what will constrain a Labour Party government from using these agencies in a much more aggressive way against critics of Labour Party policy?
Doesn't a lot of it boil down to the problem of the word disinformation or misinformation? Because there's truth and there's lies and there's stuff in between. But misinformation doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. It just means it's not approved of.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think this is. We see across the Western world the concepts of misinformation and disinformation being weaponized by state agencies to try and suppress dissent from government policies. I mean, it happened in America, it happened in New Zealand, happened in Canada, happened in Holland. So that is now, I think, a real threat to free speech. And you can actually see how the mission creep happened in the case of our own government. How do you persuade an agency set up to combat disinformation, which was originally, Putin getting bots on social media to try and interfere in elections here and in America? How do you persuade them that, someone challenging vaccine passports is guilty of disinformation? Well, the way they did it was, first of all, they decided to classify the challenge as misinformation. That often just means disagreeing with, a government policy these days. And then they said it falls into the category, therefore, of disinformation. So they created this new category, which was a merger of misinformation and disinformation, and then persuaded these agencies, look, this person who's criticised our policy is guilty of disinformation. You were set up to combat disinformation. This falls in your wheelhouse. Monitor this person.
Toby, we'll end it there. Thank you very much. I should probably say, in case the YouTube algorithm picks up on this, that I disagree with everything you've just said, and it was all disinformation. But we're very grateful for you for coming on.
I hope you don't get banned as a consequence.
Thanks very much. That's it for the week in 60 Minutes. From politics to war to chickens to killer cops and spying governments, we've covered a hell of a lot. I hope you've enjoyed it all, and please do tune in again next week. Before I go, I should thank once more our brilliant sponsor, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. They will provide you with the experience you need to build your wealth with confidence. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.